This is Richard Barrios, and I will be speaking to you today about a film that truly is unique. The 1929 psychological drama musical spectacle, The Great Gabbo. Something I'd like to say at the outset, under the opening credits, no, there's nothing wrong with your sound. As originally released in 1929, there were no sounds under the credits. No music, no nothing. And several films in 1929 were released that way, including Madam X and The Letter. Maybe it's a little odd because Gabbo has so much music in it, but this is how it was released. Now, 1929, as I'm sure many of you know, was only the first full year of sound film technology. And The Great Gabbo is very much a product of that time. Some of the technique for the uninitiated will seem rather halting, if not crude. And of course, the musical numbers indicate that this film came at a time when musicals had just started in film. Of course, they hadn't been possible in the silent era. And so this drama also has these musical numbers that are quite large, and they come basically in the second half of the film. But the technique is strange enough that in an odd way you could say it kind of acts as a complement to the very unconventional drama. And of course, here we see the very center of the drama and the on screen auteur of the film, the great Erich von Stroheim. Now, this film was made at not the highest point of von Stroheim's career. He had just come off two really disappointing films. One was the brilliant film that he had starred in and wrote and directed called The Wedding March, which was a financial disaster, followed by the famous fiasco of Queen Kelly, the film he was directing and writing for Gloria Swanson and Joseph Kennedy, from which he was rather unceremoniously fired just a few months before Gabbo was filmed. So he's coming into this, his sound film debut, not at the best place in his life. And The Great Gabbo was actually the first film in which he acted but did not direct in over 10 years, because of course he had been one of the highest profile of silent film directors in the 1920s. And there were only a few others who were known to the general public by their names. There was von Stroheim. There was also, of course, Cecil B. DeMille and D.W. Griffith. And also, another one is rather a forgotten name now, but the director and producer of The Great Gabbo, James Cruise. He had come to international prominence in 1923 with the smash hit Western epic The Covered Wagon, and had gone on from that to a number of successful and interesting films. And in 1927, he had a falling out, basically, with his home studio, Paramount, in part over the escalating costs of his seagoing epic, Old Ironsides. And Cruise was a very independent and legendarily belligerent, I might add, person, as it was. And he decided to do, which Cecil B. DeMille had also done very recently, to go out and form his own studio and make films to his specifications outside the rather limiting confines of the big studio system. So in 1927, he incorporates James Cruise Productions, and some months later buys a defunct silent film studio called Chadwick Pictures and uses that for his bass. The Great Gabbo was the first sound feature from James Cruise Productions and Cruise's first sound film as well. Now, of course, here we see the great von Stroheim as the Great Gabbo with Otto the dummy. And rather amusingly, in later years, von Stroheim evidently would claim that he had supplied the voice for Otto. No, it's not his voice. The voice belongs to that of a vaudeville actor who also did some films named George Grandy. But of course it is von Stroheim manipulating Otto and his mouth movements. And of course, this kind of story, as critics noted in 1929, would not have happened in silent film. How could it? How could you have a film with a ventriloquist being dominated by his dummy in silent film? So, like musicals, The Great Gabbo was a film that could only be possible after the coming of sound. Since James Cruise Productions was not one of the major studios, Cruise had to be very resourceful in how he structured this movie and cut corners, sometimes economically, wherever he could. Some critics in 1929 even complained that there hadn't been enough lighting in certain scenes. But Cruise did spend money on Gabbo for the musical numbers, which have always been the most controversial part of the film. And they're pretty much stacked up in the second half of the movie. But some critics in 1929 and later felt that the film just should have stayed with the drama of Gabbo and Otto and Mary and left the musical numbers to films like Gold Diggers of Broadway or On with the Show or the Broadway Melody even. But no, Cruise, in making his statement of how big and important and good an independent film could be, wanted to cover all the bases. So indeed, Gabbo was sold in some of its advertising as not only all talking, all singing, all dancing, but essentially all everything. So all drama, all talk, all song, all dance. And it was considered sort of an overload, especially since while there was no competition with Gabbo as far as its drama is concerned, there was nothing at all like it in 1929. There were many other musicals. So Gabbo sort of suffered in comparison, besides the fact that since it did not come under the banner of a major studio, even a well-made and fairly costly independent film would never have had the clout and distribution, really, that a big studio film would have had. Now, The Great Gabbo was based on a magazine story by the famous and extremely prolific Ben Hecht that appeared in Liberty magazine in August of 1928. The title of that story was The Rival Dummy. And going back and reading the story and comparing it with Gabbo is quite instructive, because even though the central conceit is pretty much the same about a troubled ventriloquist and his dummy, all the details pretty much are completely different. So Gabbo really went off on its own route away from the work of Ben Hecht. In the story, it's told as an anecdote, really, one character to another, talking about someone they observe, who is the great Gabbo. And Gabbo is like the one we see in the film, a very accomplished ventriloquist, but quite a troubled person. And in the story, the dummy's name is Jimmy. And Gabbo and Jimmy have a close relationship, and then Gabbo falls in love with a young woman who he hires to be his assistant. And in the story, her name is Rubina. And she does not care for Gabbo at all and eventually leaves. Gabbo takes it out on Jimmy the dummy and goes to the hardware store, buys an axe, and turns Jimmy into a pile of splinters. And then forever after rues the fact that he did this. And that's pretty much the story. So, as you can tell, even this early on in the film, the relationship between that story and what we see here is rather tenuous. Now, the rival dummy did not find its only dramatization here in The Great Gabbo. It turned up later on radio and early television as a story, with actors not dissimilar from Erich von Stroheim playing Gabbo both times. On the radio in 1946, it was Walter Slezak, and on television in 1952, it was Paul Lukas. Now, on the radio version of Gabbo really changes the ending and makes it into a horror story, actually, because in that one, Gabbo ends up killing his assistant and turns her into his new dummy. So it's quite a shock ending. The screenplay for The Great Gabbo was written not by Ben Hecht, but by Hugh Herbert. And this is not the playwright F. Hugh Herbert, but Hugh Herbert, the comic actor who we see in so many Warner Brothers films, usually comedies, of the 1930s. Kind of a funny-looking man who says woo-woo, this vocal tick, a lot. And we see him in such films as Footlight Parade and Wonder Bar, Midsummer Night's Dream, and he actually had the lead in a cult comedy mystery with the wonderful title, Shh, the Octopus. So we know Hugh Herbert as a comic actor, but he did work on the screenplays of several films, late silent and early sound films. And the year before Gabbo, he had written the screenplay for a very famous and very popular and incredibly crude film, which goes down in history as the first all-talking film, Lights of New York. And Hugh Herbert actually did visit the set of Gabbo. There are photographs of him posed with Betty Compson, the leading woman, on the set. So even though we don't necessarily consider him a writer, he was the one who, with, it's fair to assume with James Cruise, did construct this essentially new story for The Great Gabbo. Now, you saw a little bit earlier a pair of characters who are sort of Gabbo's neighbors who pop up in several scenes in the film to serve more or less as Greek chorus. And those actors are not identified. And my theory is that these little scenes were added on after the main film was shot for Cruise to give some explication to what would otherwise be seen as really quite unconventional and in some ways unpleasant drama. So sort of like William Holden supplies occasional narration in Sunset Boulevard, these characters do some on-screen explanation here. And John F. Hamilton is the actor, and he was later, 25 years after Gabbo, in fact, came to some screen prominence playing Eva Marie Saint's father in On the Waterfront. Betty Compson is our leading woman here, and she was, by a good measure, the most active actress in early sound film. She had actually been in film since 1915 and had come into large prominence in 1919 with the sleeper hit The Miracle Man with Lon Chaney. And she had had a pretty good star career through most of the 1920s, but she had kind of dipped and actually left film for a little bit to go into vaudeville. She did not sing or dance really, but she played the violin, and so she occasionally would tour with her violin act. But she had rebounded in popularity in 1928 with the Joseph von Sternberg film Docks of New York, in which she was really, really excellent, and in several early sound films, among them The Barker and Weary River, where she proved herself to be one of the few silent film actresses who had a voice that was felt to record and reproduce well. Some of the others who were in silent film and then in early talkies at that time, such as Dolores Costello and Mae McAvoy, were felt to not have voices that accorded well with their on-screen appearance. But Betty Compson did, and as a result, she made something like 24 films between 1928 and 1930. She sort of damaged her career, in fact, because she was so busy and appeared in so many films. Now, she was not the original casting choice for the role of Mary in The Great Gabbo. James Cruise's first idea, since this was going to be a musical, was to turn to the musical stage and engage a moderately successful singer on the Broadway stage named Jeanette MacDonald. But for whatever reason, Jeanette MacDonald did not make her film debut in The Great Gabbo. Instead, made it also in 1929 in a film that would have been considered somewhat more prestigious than Gabbo, Ernst Lubitsch's The Love Parade. So after that, James Cruise turned to a silent film actress named Pauline Stark, who had been under contract earlier to MGM, and shot several days with her, and then fired her. And the reason for her firing was seen at the time. The excuse given was that she could not remember her lines. Later on, Pauline Stark sued both for her salary and in some way for the damage to her reputation. And indeed, after a few early sound films, she did not work in film any longer. She herself claimed that she did know her lines, she did not have trouble with dialogue, but that Cruise preferred instead to go with his wife, Betty Compson. Betty Compson and James Cruise had been married in 1925, and the tempestuous nature of this marriage was known throughout Hollywood. The truth was that James Cruise was a difficult character. He drank a lot, he partied almost unremittingly, and you could probably say that just about anyone married to him would have had a rough time of it, as James Cruise and Betty Compson did. In fact, although Gabbo started shooting in May of 1929, and that was when Betty Compson came into the film, just the month before, she and James Cruise had filed for divorce. So it was quite an off and on relationship, and the divorce did become final in 1930, long after Gabbo was completed. Betty Compson starred in a couple of prominent musical films in 1929, especially the first all talking, all singing, all dancing, all Technicolor film, On with the Show. And her singing voice in that, as in Gabbo, did not belong to her because dubbing had already started in film. And we see it here also with George Grandy as Otto the Dummy, as with Betty Compson in her musical appearances. For any of you who may be familiar with the Great Gabbo at all, you've probably already seen that the print in this current edition looks better than just about anything we've seen on the Great Gabbo, more or less since 1929. And that's because this is a new transfer of the Library of Congress print of the Great Gabbo, which was made directly from the original camera negative. And earlier copies of Gabbo turned out rather muddy. There were even some issues with the synchronization of the sound. It was off a little bit. But this really does look sharp and clear, and which is not always an easy thing, especially in the case of Gabbo, which came out in several different editions. The current print of Gabbo runs about 95 and a half minutes, whereas the running time given for it in 1929 was more like 105 minutes. And a lot of that footage was a musical number that was removed later on from the film, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But otherwise, crews did tamper off and on with the print of Gabbo, so there were different cuts of the film. And you may have noticed in the opening credits the credit for multicolor, which was a two-color process that was for a little time the rival to Technicolor. And the musical numbers in Gabbo were shot both in multicolor and in black and white. In fact, the cameras were sort of positioned alongside each other, and the numbers, at least in some cases, were shot simultaneously. Unfortunately, the multicolor version of the Great Gabbo is not known to survive. There was a report a few years ago, actually, that some of the footage may have surfaced, and it turned out, alas, not to be the case. But Gabbo was released to theaters in both the part color, part multicolor, and black and white versions. And fortunately, the black and white version is what we see here and survives complete-ish. We'll say because that one musical number is gone. But we can certainly see it looking and sounding much better than it ever has before. You can also see in this scene that crews did spend some money on the set and on the extras. Except for the musical numbers, all the other scenes in Gabbo are set in very kind of close, confined spaces, which is very common with independent films. But crews did want to try to knock the audience's eyes out, so he did spend a little money. Now we see here the introduction of the second male lead, well, third if you count Otto, but his name is Don Douglas, billed here in the credits as Donald Douglas, making his film debut. And he was from musical comedy, had appeared in road companies, sometimes of operettas. And although he does sing in this film and has a quite pleasing voice, his later film career, and he made a lot of films over the next about 17 years, was primarily in drama. He very seldom had large roles in films, but he worked steadily as corrupt politicians, gangsters, otherwise usually unsympathetic supporting characters. And he did it quite well, and often in very, very small roles. One of his last roles before his death was a little more prominent than that. He is the businessman who runs away with Rita Hayworth's Gilda and then unceremoniously returns her to her husband, Glenn Ford. So if you see Gilda, that's Don Douglas from The Great Gabbo. Now we see way in the back the orchestra on the bandstand, and shortly we will hear a trio singing. And they are the Biltmore Trio, and sometimes they were the Biltmore Quartet, and they sang generally at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. And they are actually in a number of early sound films, including the Broadway Melody and the Hollywood Review of 1929, where they accompanied Joan Crawford. The Great Gabbo, as you may know, has several really kind of odd songs, and this is certainly one of the oddest. It's called the Lollipop Song, or Icky, and George Grandy is singing about his lollipop. It's very odd. And as some observers felt at the time, would it really have been possible for von Stroheim to be sitting opposite his dummy and have the dummy be singing and moving his lips and all that while von Stroheim sits? So it requires a bit of suspension of disbelief, perhaps. Now, the basic premise of Gabbo, essentially an unstable person who manifests his finer qualities through his dummy, was revisited on several other occasions in film, even though Gabbo itself hadn't been a great hit. It proved to have a fair amount of resonance, and probably the best later version of that came with the 1945 British film Dead of Night, the multi-story horror film, which had an electrifying performance by Michael Redgrave as a mad ventriloquist. And then in the 1970s, there was the film Magic with Anthony Hopkins. So even though Gabbo was not a big hit in 1930, it did end up having some staying power in an interesting way. Erich von Stroheim himself, even though he hadn't originally written or directed this film, also maintained an association, let's say, with Gabbo. And in 1943, he inquired after the rights with the thought perhaps of remaking The Great Gabbo, and found out instead that the rights had been sold to someone who was, in fact, the most famous ventriloquist in the world, Edgar Bergen. And of course, Edgar Bergen, with or without Charlie McCarthy, never did anything with the story rights to Gabbo, but evidently at some point he was considering it. Gabbo also turned up in a 1990s episode of The Simpsons that some of you may recall. And in that manifestation, Gabbo was not the name of the ventriloquist, but of a nasty dummy who takes over Krusty the Clown's position and does it in a very unpleasant way.
I think Otto would like to have you do these things for him again. Comb his hair, fix his tie.
Now, von Stroheim's
I would love it.
nickname, even back in the 1920s, was the man you love to hate.
Well, maybe I will.
And of course, that certainly ties in well with his characterization
Getting late.
of Gabbo.
Better go to the theater.
And some critics, even at the time, said
Come on, Mary.
how well you like this movie will depend on what you think of von Stroheim, because
Have everything now, Mary. Nice.
everyone agreed that he was very skillful as an actor as well as a writer and director, but how likable
Be careful.
his on-screen persona was another matter entirely. And of course, in The Great Gabbo, he does not flinch from being completely unlikable and yet very sad and kind of pathetic. Now here we can hear the Biltmore Trio in the background singing The Web of Love. And that's one of the Gabbo songs that they did record that year on phonograph record, along with another Gabbo song, I'm in Love with You. Now we're in the second half, essentially, of the movie, which is where all the musical numbers are stacked up. And that is where Gabbo turns from being a rather stark drama to a musical review. And again, as I mentioned, not all the critics were in agreement with that. And here we're at the theater, and there's a live orchestra playing. Now, there is some question about where these numbers were shot. They seem far too large to have been shot in Cruise's rather small and cramped studio. And one source some years ago told me that the numbers may have been filmed at the Los Angeles Shrine Auditorium, which had been built not that many years before this. But I looked at some photos of the proscenium at the Shrine Auditorium, and they're not the same. And the Shrine stage was even larger than this one. So my theory is that these were shot in a Los Angeles theater, and they brought in dress extras to be the audience, as well as Howard Jackson conducting the orchestra. Howard Jackson, the musical director for Gabbo, more often was under contract to Fox Films. And as soon as he was finished with Gabbo, he went to Fox to work on one of the big musical successes of 1929, the film Sunny Side Up, which, like Gabbo, had at least one musical number in multicolor. The young woman we see here is Marjorie Babe Kane, and she's very much in the mold of Helen Kane, the Boop-a-Doop girl who was so popular and the model for Betty Boop. And Margie Kane is in a number of early sound features and musicals as well. And she serves no story function in The Great Gabbo, but does get to appear in several of the musical numbers. And as we will see very shortly, the intimate nature of the song, this kind of nice bouncy song, every now and then, gets turned into a rather large and hectic chorus number in the style of many stage reviews of the 1920s. We can also see that these dancers were not always coordinated properly. A young gentleman just dropped his cane on the stage, and that blooper was kept in the film. There were so many musicals being shot right at this time, in mid-1929, that a number of young hopefuls came to Hollywood to be chorus girls and boys in early musicals without a lot of training, and that is sometimes apparent. Not just in this film, but in a number of early musicals, which were shot quickly and expediently. As you will observe, and maybe already have, the choreography of the great Gabbo has more energy, maybe, than it does elan or skill. The dances are the work of Maurice Coussel, who had been a performer and was a dance director in the Los Angeles area. He had already done the dance numbers for a couple of silent films, and then for the big Universal nightclub musical Broadway. And you could say that some of the production numbers in The Great Gabbo don't leave well enough alone, because they don't just feature one chorus, but several choruses and sometimes even a ballet. In the style of maybe big stage reviews. In this context, they do seem a bit eccentric, although amusing. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most, if not all, of the onstage numbers in Gabbo were shot simultaneously in black and white and in the multicolor process. And multicolor highlighted the colors blue and orange, whereas Technicolor highlighted red and green. And there are a few surviving examples of multicolor. And it was actually quite pleasing. But it never caught on the same way Technicolor did. And multicolor was actually the predecessor of the Cinecolor process, which was used widely in the 1940s and into the early 50s, mostly in westerns. If you see a low-budget western in color that has blue trees, it will have been shot in Cinecolor. Now, we're backstage in theater with Mary and her partner, and by this point, even in mid-1929, backstage and dressing rooms and theater corridors were extremely familiar territory for millions of filmgoers. With the Al Jolson films in 1927 and 28, and then the Broadway Melody early in 1929, which is the first real, truly musical feature film. Backstage musicals took off with a vengeance, which explains why Gabbo was made that way as much as anything else. And Betty Compson herself had starred as a theater diva in one of the early big ones, On With the Show, made in Technicolor. So this was very, very familiar territory. Maybe a bit too much so, because by maybe March of the following year, musicals were starting to burn themselves out because there had been so many of them, and so many of them differentiated. And even with its unconventional plot, Gabbo did go backstage and stay there for a long time. Now, an interesting scene here with von Stroheim as Gabbo and his dresser. They speak German, and there are no subtitles or any other translation, which is something you'd probably only see this early in the sound era. It gives a little conviction to the scene, actually. Von Stroheim himself, of course, later on in American film, although he had had some failures, but then came back in the 1940s and scored especially well in two films directed by Billy Wilder, Five Graves to Cairo, where he played Erwin Rommel, and then, of course, Sunset Boulevard in 1950. And following his great success as Max in Sunset Boulevard, some fly-by-night film distributor got a hold of the great Gabbo and re-released it to capitalize on von Stroheim's renewed fame. But what this distributor did was basically cut out all the musical numbers. So Gabbo ended up being very, very short. This didn't get a whole lot of play, but it did happen.
Und gehen Sie mit Ihrer Freundin heute Abend irgendwo hin. Und sind Sie lieb und nett zu ihr. Da halten Sie sich gut.
Stop there, Gabbo. You'll have to hurry, Mr. Gabbo.
As a number of critics noted in 1929, the lighting, and you can kind of tell in this scene, Cruise cut a corner with the lighting. And that's one thing that distinguishes Gabbo from major studio product, even though bigger films would have used the confined sets in the early sound era. Nevertheless, they would have been better lit than this one is. And it's interesting that critics found this to zero in on, but indeed they did.
I want to ever see you again. Get out!
Von Stroheim actually had enough of a personal success with Gabbo that he did go on to act only in a few other early sound films into 1932, actually. The biggest successes were probably the spy drama Three Faces East and Greta Garbo's As You Desire Me. And he played kind of her evil Svengali in that. And they were really quite a riveting pair. And then after that, he went over to Fox, contracted to direct, not star in, but direct and write another film called Walking Down Broadway. And that, unfortunately, ended up being another von Stroheim fiasco, where he was discharged from the film and it was put into other hands. Of course, that had been a leitmotif of his career from Foolish Wives onward. He would make really, really fine films, but then go so far over budget and over schedule that he would run afoul of his bosses. Most famously, this happened at Metro-Goldwyn, about to be MGM, with his masterwork Greed, where he did a 40-reel cut of a film, and it was finally taken away from him and released only as 10 reels. And Greed is still a great film, but of course the uncut von Stroheim Greed has always remained one of the great what-ifs of motion picture history. Now, we don't know for certain exactly how Otto's voice was handled here, whether or not George Grandy was on the set or did some post-recording of the voice. I suspect it was a combination of both. In early sound films, occasionally, the actors who would do the vocal, whether it's talking or dialogue, were often on the set, off camera, delivering their dialogue. But in either way, it's coordinated very well here.
You better keep quiet.
I will if you let me. A song written for me especial. I get by.
Now, it must be admitted that the writing of the scenes with Gabbo and Otto on stage don't necessarily demonstrate to us why his act was such a sensation. It's technically quite astute, but the material seems weak. Now, whether intentionally or not, that does demonstrate what a lot of vaudeville is, where an act like Gabbo and Otto would not have been totally uncommon. It's just that normally it would not have acquired enough acclaim to star in a big Broadway review as it does here.
He blames me for everything. He blames me.
Just for that now, you can't sit any longer on my knee. You understand?
Suits me all right.
Now,
I have sit on much better.
after
Are
this
you wise to that?
bit that they're doing here on stage, in the original cut of the film, Gabbo and Otto continued to appear in what is now a lost number, shot originally in multicolor, called The Gaga Bird. And that is, for some of us early musical buffs, one of the great losses of early film. Now, you will see a little clip of The Gaga Bird late in the film, and coming up in not very long, you will also see the chorus girls coming off stage with their costumes for the Gaga Bird. And those costumes and the whole concept of the number via Maurice Coussel is what makes it so fascinating, because it involved big chickens. The chorus girls were dressed as big chickens and kind of stomped around on the stage wearing big webbed feet. And there was Otto in the middle, presumably singing the song The Gaga Bird, which, like the other songs from the great Gabbo, was published. And I have played the song, and it really is one of the strangest songs ever written, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unlike Otto's little ditty here, I'm Laughing, which really does connect well with the situation of Otto being the conduit for Gabbo's finer feelings. Now, since I am not old enough to recall vaudeville, I cannot say for sure that an act of this sort would have been accomplished enough to have a ventriloquist and his dummy sitting this far apart and yet being basically believable as two entities without the controls being a little more noticeable. But it's the magic of film, isn't it?
Say, where do I come in? I could hide some hot dogs without any trouble.
You said I was you. So I'm eating enough for both of us.
And of course,
Well then,
von Stroheim's
I have
persona
a in your stomach.
publicly was enough that the dislikability that he shows so unflinchingly as Gabbo would have been a fair equivalent of the way a lot of people in the audience would have seen him. He did not always play sympathetic characters, although he had pretty much in The Wedding March. But he himself was seen as being this rather stern, Teutonic personality, Viennese actually. But he does use that persona very skillfully in Gabbo. Now, we see Betty Compson here in costume for her big number, which is coming up shortly, called I'm in Love with You.
What are you doing in his dressing room?
Oh, nothing. Nothing at all. I was just
And we
passing
will
by and everything
talk
was
about
closed,
that
and I
number
thought,
shortly,
"Things up
as it will be coming on.
Why should
But
you
first,
bother
we
about
get
it?
to see
What's
a
the big
little
idea,
taste of the Gaga Bird with the shot of the chorus girls coming off stage in their chicken costumes.
I suppose you're going to tell me that you're still sorry for him.
I don't believe I'll tell you anything at all.
Now, well, I'll tell him something if he doesn't stay away from you.
Oh, don't say anything, please.
On stage for I'm in love with you number. On stage, please.
They ought to let the great Gabbo do that number.
Oh, don't be silly.
And there we see the Gaga chickens. There's only one surviving still that I've ever seen of the number. It was a giant barnyard. It's too bad we can't see it. But we can see the number that follows, which is a lengthy production number to the song I'm in Love with You, which probably at the time would have been judged the song written for Gabbo that had the most popular appeal. And this number was originally shot in multicolor as well as in black and white, and the heavy makeup you can see on Betty Compson's face kind of gives it away that it would have been shot in color. And also the decor, which seems multi-hued. Now when you see a long shot, you will see women posing inside the pillars on either side of the large stairs. And that was actually publicized at the time because, according to the publicity, those women were, in the tradition of certain salacious Broadway revues like the Earl Carroll Vanities, actually completely naked, wearing only a coat of white powder to make them look like statues, and of course standing very still. Now whether that is the case, I cannot say, because you don't get close enough to them to really see. But that is what the publicity alleged. And of course you'd get some talk that way. As you can see, the set is quite deep. It goes back quite a ways. And here we have Betty Compson's dance double as well as her vocal double performing the number. And interestingly enough, the voice does have a Jeanette MacDonald quality of soprano to it. So we can imagine what Ms. MacDonald would have sounded like doing this number. And we're only in the second chorus of the number here, but rest assured it goes on and on quite a bit. In the tradition of, let's say, the less than sterling Broadway revues, and for all its inadequacies perhaps in the musical staging department, the great Gabbo does give us an inkling of what some of these mid-range Broadway revues would have been like. And one thing I do want to mention is that Howard Jackson, the musical director, did come up with some very nice orchestrations here, and the arrangements are quite pleasing.
Thanks very much.
But there is also the staging of I'm in Love with You, which is rather amusing because,
I like it pretty well myself.
except for one section where you'll see, it doesn't involve a whole lot of dance. It basically involves people walking around. In time to the music, fortunately, and up and down the stairs. Now, I said earlier that this print that we're seeing of the Great Gabbo is off the Library of Congress owned camera negative. Interestingly, this number had the most damage, nitrate decomposition of any section of the film that they had, so that had to be obtained from other sources. And we see the Andre Ani costumes. Andre Ani had worked at MGM and had dressed Greta Garbo in a couple of her early films. And like James Cruz had left the major studio system and was working here as an independent contractor. One critic in 1929 said this of this particular number: "One tires of seeing ladies of the ballet walking up and down stairs in intricate drills. They don't seem to be getting anywhere." Nevertheless, this was the way Maurice Coussel decided to stage the number, and it can be theorized anyway that it did look striking in multicolor. Unfortunately, the color itself was criticized in a number of reviews. Not so much for the design, but for its indistinct, blurry, sometimes smeary look. I don't know if that came from the way it was shot or the way it was processed, but it did rate comment in a number of reviews. And here we have the Corps de Ballet coming out for yet another chorus of I'm in Love with You, reminding us that precision ensemble was not always a requisite in 1929 musical cinema. But it's here, and that's what Mr. Coussel intended. And of course, the technique of playing a song over and over while the chorus went through different permutations was something very near and dear later on to Busby Berkeley, who was, of course, an innovator, where Maurice Coussel was, a technician, essentially. That curtain seems a bit garish. Obviously, it was designed for color. And of course, now we're back to backstage. And this little scene here with von Stroheim and Otto, I would propose, sort of shows more than any other why his performance is so affecting. He really does show the sensitivity beneath that stern and forbidding and sometimes horrible exterior. And the nuances he brings in this scene in particular, and through a good deal of the rest of the film, aren't at all in the original Hecht short story. It could be theorized that this was something von Stroheim did himself. I would say it was a collaboration between he and James Cruz. In later years, Stroheim gave Cruz a great deal of the credit for his performance as Gabbo. But the sensitivity under the forbidding hard shell is something that von Stroheim was very good at, and you can certainly see it in Sunset Boulevard later on. And of course, no, Gabbo is nowhere near as accomplished a meditation on life and art as Sunset Boulevard is, but Stroheim gives it a great deal of depth in ways that I don't think any other performer in 1929 would have done.
You remember? I always said they all come back.
I'm laughing.
Yes, Otto?
And one of the fascinations in the pairing of von Stroheim with Betty Compson is that he can show the fragility under the toughness,
He never stood in the wings before.
and she's sort of just the opposite. She shows the strength
Oh, I'm not ridiculous.
under the
Everyone in the company
kind of
knows that.
fragile look that she has. And Betty Compson was very good for doing that
I'm not doing anything.
in the earlier 1920s, when she was
What looks bad?
quite a big
Does it
name.
look bad if I
She
talk to
played
the
more
dog show? There
conventional
isn't one of them in the company
heroine
that would
roles
rather
in
even
films
look
like
at
The
me.
Little Minister.
Besides,
But by this point, where she's in her early 30s,
And you do.
she had developed
I
a
do.
kind of harder quality that could be seen in a film like Docks of New York, the von Sternberg film, where she's really brilliant. And also for The Barker, for which she received what would now be considered an Academy Award nomination as Best Actress. It would have been very affecting, I think, to see her as Belle Watling in Gone with the Wind, which she did test for, but of course was not cast.
We are sitting on top of the world.
And now the tense drama will be interrupted once again by a multicolor dance number featuring Margie Babe Kane. This one, I would say, is probably the most extraneous of all the musical sequences in the film, since she is not a character who really connects with the others dramatically, and the song called The New Step doesn't really offer us any kind of connection with the plot. It's simply a 1920s convention of a hot dance, that the song is actually about the dance in the tradition of the Charleston and the Black Bottom, for example. And of course, with her Helen Kane, Betty Boop voice and manner, Ms. Kane is pretty ideal for this sort of thing. And she had served in a similar capacity right before Gabbo in the Paramount feature The Dance of Life. And now we see what was obviously quite a eye-catcher in multicolor with the spinning color wheels. Now, one can't know for sure exactly how these looked in color, but since there were many reviews that complained about the indistinct or blurry quality of much of the color, it could be theorized, I think, that these particular scenic moments would probably have caused eye strain in some viewers. It might be mentioned here also that the very distinguished British film historian Paul Rotha wrote that these were the most inferior color scenes in any film that he ever knew of. So that's quite a massive statement. And of course some whimsical Andre Ani costume designs, once again, from bellhops and young women who look like they have giant Q-tips on their heads. So it does certainly break up the dramatic tension. Whether or not that's really a good thing is up to the viewer. But right afterward, we are back to the Gabbo plotline. And this is a scene that probably would have only happened in 1929, given the technical limitations and conventions of the time, where the movie essentially stops dead for a couple of minutes to allow Gabbo to order dinner on the phone, and for von Stroheim to pretend that he's speaking to someone else. And we get the whole menu. It's one of the reasons, I think, why some viewers if they're not used to the rhythms, can have a bit of trouble with early talkies.
She loves that.
Now, most of the dialogue sequences that seem rather ponderous to us in early sound films are conversations between one and two or sometimes three characters. This one seems perhaps a little bit starker because it's only one person,
Some caviar.
and not even Otto is saying anything in this scene.
You know, Otto,
And
she remembers
Stroheim goes through the entire menu.
and lobster does not agree with me. And Philip, boneless squab cooked in coconut. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's it.
Stroheim does manage to give it some of his character touches,
Hearts of
however.
palm tree salad à la vinaigrette. Yeah. And listen, Philip, a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, extra dry, very cold. Yeah. I'll leave it all to you. Philip.
Now,
Oh,
the one thing one can say about this scene is that it does sort of serve as the palate cleanser before the main event, which is the largest or most spectacular musical number, which is going to be happening right about now. And here it is, the famous, or one could say infamous, Web of Love number. And yes, that is indeed a huge spider web with Betty Compson and Don Douglas in the middle of it, dressed as a spider and a fly, and various fly chorus people on the floor and also on the web itself. It's a very bizarre concept, but Coussel and Andréani went the whole route with it, and it is certainly memorable. It was also considered one of the strong selling points for the great Gabbo, especially for the musical portions of the film. Shots of the number were used in some of the advertising and on lobby cards, and then most spectacularly of all, the way it was used to promote the world premiere of The Great Gabbo, which was in New York City on September 12th, 1929, and it occurred at the Selwyn Theater on 42nd Street, right off Broadway, which is still there. All these years later, it became the American Airlines Theater and is used, as it had been originally, as a legitimate Broadway theater. Gabbo was one of the rare films that was run there, and that did happen sometimes with the major film productions during the early sound era, where they would be shown in regular Broadway houses. The opening engagement for Gabbo was considered quite prestigious. And then there was that spider web. On the roof of the Selwyn Theater, a number of stories above 42nd Street, was erected a huge spider web, pretty much identical to the one we see here. And a number of young women, obviously intrepid, crawled around it at night while searchlights played upon it. It was eye-catching and possibly quite a bit hazardous, and in fact the New York Police Department got alarmed and shut it down, and then after a little time it was allowed to reopen. Now, of course, here we're not only seeing Betty Compson and Don Douglas, we're seeing their dance doubles, who can, especially he, can be spotted in the longer shots, since he has quadriceps that are quite larger than Don Douglas. Now, Yes, this is very strange. It isn't only the young women crawling around on the spider web, it is the very strenuous and excellently executed adagio dance that they're doing. It's very alien to our concepts, of course, of musical numbers, but this would have been a thing in both vaudeville and in musical reviews in the 1920s. Of course, now when you see this number in a theater with an audience, as I've been privileged to do, the audience is very close to tears because it's just so strange. And then occasionally you do see the young women on the web getting momentarily stuck. Then there are those costumes of those women standing in the back with the pearls kind of dripping all over their faces and these wild wigs. One time I lectured at a screening in which this number was run, and the audience was killing themselves laughing at it. And afterward, an elderly gentleman came up to me and he was quite annoyed. He said, "How could you be making fun of these beautiful adagio dancers?" And I explained to him, yes, I understand the dancers are extremely good and very, very talented, but this concept is just so wild that people are just sort of unnerved by it. If I can inject a personal note here as well, I had a couple of friends of mine, and she was actually trained in dance, who, after the first time they saw this number, were terminally fascinated by it, and were very, very happy when, at their wedding reception, I actually sang this song to them. It is fascinating, certainly.
Please don't do anything. I'll tell him.
All right. If you don't tell him, I will.
And of course, it's amusing to hear the inserted audio and visual interjections from Compson and Douglas, which don't quite match. And you can sometimes hear the sound bump coming in and out of it. But it was a big deal at the time. And it can only raise the question, after this, what does one do for an encore? If you look closely, the chorus women appear to be singing. I doubt if they were really singing. The microphones would have been recording the orchestra, and there was probably a chorus off camera doing the singing. And this is the only time we see Margie Kane in anything actually related to the plot.
It must be his birthday. And did you notice he changed his brand of perfume?
And following the web of love, we now have a chorus routine in one, which means in front of the curtain, usually while the scenery is being changed. This was a standard feature of Broadway revues. And of course, that web would have taken a while to take down and to get the young women off it. This chorus routine, set to I'm in Love with You, was actually reused 3 years later in another independent film called The Girl from Calgary, starring Fifi Dorsey. And this number was lifted and put into the film, albeit with other music. And that film also used a little bit of Every Now and Then and some of the audience reaction shots. Such was the nature of low-budget filmmaking that something like that could be rented or borrowed and reused. And after the dancers exit the stage, we are left with the rather sad resolution of the plot, which takes a while, but is very well performed by von Stroheim and by Betty Compson.
Did you find the flowers in the dressing room?
A bit more about James Cruz, that turbulent and talented filmmaker. When he formed his own production company in 1927, his financing was a little bit wobbly. Of course, he wasn't going to be doing major productions like The Covered Wagon. Gabbo was costly enough, but he had to get outside financing. The opening credits of Gabbo list two presenters, Henry Meyer and Nat Cordish, who obviously supplied James Cruz with some of the financing for Gabbo. Unfortunately, Mr. Cordish was sort of a problem. He had made his fortune, such as it was, as an auto salesman. But a couple of years before, Gabbo had gotten involved in a shady development and oil deal. And before Gabbo was even in theaters, had been convicted for usury, kind of swindling, and got a 10-year sentence. So such were the vagaries of independent film financing in the 1920s and probably up to the present day. Anyway, after his company closed in 1931, James Cruz did go back to the big studio system that he had tried to leave, and he did several major films on the strength of his reputation in the 1920s. A good kind of political comedy at Columbia called Washington Merry-Go-Round, and then an excellent kind of low-life melodrama he did for United Artists called I Cover the Waterfront, and two films with Will Rogers at Fox. Then he went to Universal and kind of reverted to his old extravagant Old Ironside ways. He directed an epic drama, would-be epic drama called Sutter's Gold, which became notorious for its cost overruns, the fact that it almost sunk its studio. And after that, Cruz was not invited to go back to any of the major companies. The only film work he was able to get after that were 4 films at the New Republic Studios, which was definitely not considered one of the majors, especially at that time. And after that, it was silence. He had become even more of an alcoholic than he did before, and in not too many years was dead. Some sources say that he died of alcoholism. At least one source has said that he committed suicide. Either way, it was a sad and premature ending to a really very talented man who had personal demons. So many of his films are lost now. both some of the silent titles and also most of the talkies that he produced for his own production company. Gabbo, of course, does survive and turned up quite frequently on television following, I guess, that last peculiar theatrical run it had with all its musical numbers cut out. And, of course, coming upon it on the Late Late Show on television in the 1970s, as some of us did, it seemed extremely odd. But once you got past the 1929 longueurs and the strange musical numbers, you sort of realized that there was quite a bit of substance here. And it wasn't just one of the more trivial musicals involving hoofers and their heartbreak, but that there were some larger issues being grappled with. There is, for example, the unflinching portrayal of a terrifying, if fascinating, abusive relationship, and the relationship of a performer to his audience, and the kind of walled-off nature in which a person cannot consciously express their feelings, but find other ways to do it indirectly. None of this was dealt with in other musicals in 1929, and that is why many critics were certainly quick to point out that this was a film that was different from the ordinary run of Gold Diggers of Broadway, On with the Show, that kind of thing. How successfully it does these things perhaps can be disputed, but it certainly is trying for far more than the run of most popular filmmaking did in 1929, which is also why I think filmmakers later picked up on the whole ventriloquist and dummy theme in films like Dead of Night. Now Gabbo has had his unfortunate but probably inevitable confrontation with reality, and the rest of the film will now depict his slide downward. Once again, von Stroheim gives the material everything he can give it, and it's kind of hard to watch because of the way we've seen this once proud figure crumble. Betty Compson was a strong enough performer that even in a scene like this with a rather halting dramatic arc to it, she can give it a great deal of conviction. It's unfortunate that in the years after Gabbo, her career went the way it did, with uninteresting roles and even some exploitation things like Escort Girl is one, which certainly didn't portray her to best advantage. She was out of film by 1948 when she was middle-aged. And later in life, she and her husband had an ashtray business, of all things. But enough of her films survive that we can see that she was quite a talent, as well as very beautiful, obviously.
And what has happened made me realize it more than ever.
It's just interesting to speculate also on the currents during the making of The Great Gabbo between she and Cruz with their off and on marriage, which was, of course, on the rocks, even while the making was continued, and how she processed that when she was going back and forth between von Stroheim and Don Douglas here on film. And Don Douglas, for his part, did have a great deal of ease with dialogue and went on to the long career that he did. And you just heard a reference to Mammy songs. The specter of Al Jolson was very prominent, of course, in 1929 after The Jazz Singer and The Singing Fool. Now we're entering what could probably be seen as James Cruise's most audacious directorial touch in this film. Gabbo's delusional montage of production numbers. It sort of serves as a reprise of the songs we've heard, but it's also just this very riveting depiction of what a person who's totally lost their moorings might be thinking or feeling. And it also gives us a few seconds more of the Gaga bird. And these clips are actually pieces of the actual number, which is otherwise lost.
Say goodbye to me. Only to you. You stupid wooden dummy.
And that's as close as we come to seeing the violence of the original short story, where Gabbo actually takes an axe to his dummy. And here, with von Stroheim's sensitivity, we get more than that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Otto. I'm so sorry.
And some more odd Andreani costumes. And here's the montage starting. And we'll see bits of the musical numbers. Almost expressionistic in its look. And here comes the Gaga bird. There are the chickens, and there's the dancing Otto on the side there. And you actually hear a little tiny piece of the song in that snippet.
On stage for the finale.
I'm sorry, Gabbo.
There's no other musical that I could think of that has a sequence quite like this. We even get the color wheels from the new step. And once again, as you can see on the sides of the stage, we have what were publicized as the naked women, all powdered up. The costumes for this finale are especially notable because they're very strange. They're sort of Egyptian looking. I'm not sure what the thought was there. And once again, we get the web of love and a lot of people on stage. And then here is the part that's really kind of hard to watch. Sort of the predecessor of later scenes where a performer has a breakdown on stage.
You don't know how to laugh. You don't know. Every one of you that knows how to laugh.
And once again, von Stroheim plays it for all that he can, even as the dancers shrink away in terror.
Come on, show it. You can't laugh either. I can't laugh. I know I can't laugh.
for the top-billed performer to go off the rails to this extent is quite something. And then to have to pick it up with the laughing strains of the new step is quite striking.
What's the matter with you? You realize what you've done, Gabbo. You ruined the entire finale. And you won't do it again. I won't have my show ruined by you. Every performance, it's something else. You've got to get out.
What do I care for your show?
Gabbo, of course, now is completely unmoored from reality, even more than he had been earlier in the film. So we see once again why this film made a big impression. Perhaps even why someone as successful as Edgar Bergen was fascinated with it to the point of where he actually thought of remaking it. It's just so far out of the backstage musical mainstream. It certainly would not have been produced by a major studio. So it ends up being this fascinating aberration, I guess, that 10 decades after it was made, we can still see the interest in it and the truth. The first wave of musical cinema ended in mid-1930 in large part because so many films, especially backstage films, seemed so alike, cut so much from the same pattern. Gabbo quite obviously does not follow that pattern at all. And you wonder if other films, had they taken the chances that the great Gabbo does, if they might have made the first musical wave last a little longer than it did. It's very, very affecting little scene, played almost entirely in silence between von Stroheim and Compson. They're learning how to use silence in sound film.
Take care of him, Louis. Don't leave him alone.
Yes, madame, I'll take care of him. Don't worry.
And one more interjection from our otherwise sort of anonymous Greek chorus.
Well, there you are. That's the great Gabbo for you.
Once again, they are telling us things we've already seen and understand, but in a way that was considered necessary for 1929 audiences to make sense of this unconventional presentation.
And it exploded.
Yeah, well, he's got one thing to be thankful for. All he's got for a partner is a dummy.
Yeah, me and him both.
Ow!
And interesting wisecracks that we don't really hear otherwise in the movie, but which were a staple of backstage films. Fortunately, our vaudevillians don't have the last word. It's left to von Stroheim in a really, really sad and affecting final scene here. What could be sadder to a lead performer than to see his name being taken off the marquee so ignominiously? And poor Otto is just sort of hanging there. We see one final demonstration of Gabbo's superstitious nature also. He avoids passing under the ladder, but he's had plenty enough bad luck as it is, and goes off with Otto. It's very sad. Not too many 1929 musicals ended on such a somber note. The only one I could think of is Glorifying the American Girl, where the heroine ends the movie as a Broadway star, yet in a great deal of misery. This is probably a bit more honest. And we're having another of the conventions of 1929 musical cinema here, exit music. The lights in the theater would be coming up, but the orchestra on film would be playing the audience out of their seats. And it gives us an opportunity once again to hear Howard Jackson's really nice musical arrangements of the various songs for the Gabbo score. It's been a great deal of fun for me to talk to you about the great Gabbo. And in closing, I will just quote Mary as she says to Gabbo, "Remember that you only get out of life what you put into it." Thanks for listening, folks, and goodbye.